This week, we're going to begin or continue in the historical books. That seems like a very plain description of the scriptures that contain so much of the history of the lives of the kings in particular, um, through the time that the Israelites had been established in the Promised Land, specifically as we've been looking throughout the building and the establishment of David's kingdom, in which peace and prosperity and much stability were brought to the Israelites during that time. But obviously, we're looking at something that goes beyond history itself, as if this were simply an account of human lives or a particular people and their kingdom. As we have gone through the scriptures thus far, we've been careful to point out and keep hold of the eternal purpose of God as it is worked out in the midst of man. When we first began, there was even from a scriptural standpoint, a laying of a foundation of the purposes of God in creation. So the descriptions and events of the lives of those who were involved were a little more broad and generalized. And we see that the actual written accounts, were more likely than not a consolidation of several different accounts put into agreement and then made into a more formal writing in the Torah. The Torah being given as that which was given to the people of God, the Israelites in particular, via the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and specifically, worked out in the life of Moses after they were released from their slavery in Egypt. And God began then to make a people. So we saw that not only did things become less general in terms of the description of the lives of the people, we began to see some of the more intimate circumstances of the lives of these individuals, which I believe are historically true and geographically true in terms of their location on the earth. But what we're finding and what we've been looking at is how these truths of God's eternal purpose are being worked out in the individual lives, but now more specifically in the lives of a people, and even more so now in the lives of a people who have now become a kingdom with a king. There was an interesting transition that took place between the period of the time of the rulers or judges over Israel in the time of the kings, when Israel wanted to have a king like other nations. So there was a rejection that took place of having God as their king. And so God allowed them to have a king, but he said specifically to Samuel that it's not you that they've rejected, it's me. They've chosen to have a ruler, and God told them this is how kings will treat you. Still, the Lord rose up David to be the great king of Israel, and not just a historical king, but a type of the Christ and the Messiah. There was even some recognition on David's part as a prophet of the Lord to look forward to the Messianic kingdom, the kingdom of the Christ, of the Anointed One. So with David's life and with his rule as a king, we really see some establishment of honoring the things of God, honoring the Anointed One of God. and seeking out the heart and the purposes of God, which we looked at in the last or in 2 Samuel, specifically with David's desire to build a house for the Lord, which today we're going to reference a number of times in relation to the early portion of Solomon's reign, because David was not allowed to actually physically construct a temple for the Lord. And there's a reason for that, many reasons. From the Lord's perspective, one and the primary thing that I want us to see and take with us as we continue through the scriptures is that the Lord never required nor asked for a house of cedar. In other words, a house built out of the materials of the earth. And so as we go into the early part of Solomon's reign, we're going to see some fulfillment in that, yes, Solomon was David's son, and it was promised that one of David's descendants would be the one who built the house for God. So the true nature and construction of this house is very much, or the construction of the temple is very detailed. However, the nature of God's house is not, by God's requirement, set in these things. So in many ways, David was looking into the things that Moses had seen in terms of what God had shown him of the heavenly tabernacle. And so we know that the tabernacle in the wilderness was built after that, so that it had the three courts, so that there was the holy place, and then there were the utensils used in the priestly service, from the altar, to the washing laver, to the altar, to the showbread, the table for the showbread, the lights for the menorah that were in the inner courts, and then all the way into the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of God, was set. And so, although the materials used to build were different, the design and construction in many ways were the same, but it was a pattern, okay? What I want us to see and understand is that it was always a shadow of something greater. And so God touches on that point in his response through Nathan the prophet to David when he says, have I ever asked for this? But there's another side of it that he says no one has ever offered. And so the Lord was very pleased with David's heart to consider the house, the dwelling place of God. And so he blesses David and his family and his line, which actually had been previously prophesied through Jacob, who became Israel, to his son Judah, that the scepter would always remain in Judah's house. And so we see that David was of the line of Judah, and in the lineage of Christ, who was also in the line of Judah. So there was a purpose of God that was being fulfilled in all this. What can become a little bit confusing is the fulfillment here with this temple versus the spiritual and therefore eternal, unchangeable promise of the dwelling place of God that was given to his people. So what I want us to see is, while there is in a sense, a physical fulfillment here, even through the lineage from David to Solomon, and in the building of the temple, the construction of this very beautiful temple, of which there has never been a greater representation, earthly representation of that temple than there was here in Solomon's temple. And if you read these first chapters of 1 Kings, it's very obvious that this was a really incredible structure. I mean, I think that it said something like, I don't remember the weight of gold that was used in the temple, but it was like 25 tons of gold, something like that. Okay, that's over 50,000 pounds of gold. Okay, Now, a modern day reference to value is kind of interesting to consider, since 1 ounce of gold, of which there are, if I'm correct, 16 ounces in a pound, okay, in 1 pound, okay, 1 ounce is, about $1,300 in today's in U.S. money. All right, so that is, approximately $21,000 for 1 pound of gold right now. And there was over 50,000 pounds of gold used in the temple. And that didn't count the other materials. If you looked at what Solomon did with, like, the Sea of Bronze, okay, they called it the Bronze Sea. And even in that time, it was said that they didn't even try to weigh or count the amount of bronze that was used for the Bronze Sea, for the oxen that were underneath it, for the washing lavers and the movable tables, because it was literally impossible to count or weigh that much bronze. And bronze had its own value as well. I'm not trying to get into the cost of things, but the immeasurable, they considered the temple and Solomon's palace to be like fortresses of Lebanon, because the sheer amount of the trees that were used. So what was it, the temple, all of Solomon's palace and everything were completely overlaid with cedar. I think they used some pine on the floors, it's mentioned, but then all the walls and roof and everything were constructed with cedar over the rocks that were laid. And anyway, these were some pretty amazing places. And we'll point this out as we go through, but even when Solomon dedicated the temple, he said, how could the God of heaven dwell in a place like this? Even though it's this great, this cannot contain the God of heaven. And the reason I mention that now is because it's very easy to look historically and then therefore to try and look ahead and say, have an idea of what the temple of God is. In more recent history, I don't know if you guys have traveled around enough, either the U.S. or specifically in other countries. If you visit one of the larger cathedrals, they're just insane how they're built out. In their size and their decadence, there's an idea that's carried on as to what the house of God is. And honestly, the Lord was quick to abandon that idea, even though he allowed Solomon to build it. So what's very evident is that not only the physical house was not what God was after, the physical building, but also he was looking for something beyond an earthly dynasty of the rule and bloodline of man. Although he did maintain it, there was something more there. We recently had a young man, actually just yesterday, that checked in to tent camp at our place, and he was recently released from the Israeli army. And something moved in me. And what was interesting to me is it was very similar to the movement inside me. It's not emotional, although I can feel a touch of emotion with it. But something moved in my heart to see this young Israeli man. I mean, literally, I felt in many ways, this sounds goofy, but that I was looking in the face of Jesus, because I saw a Jew of Israel, a multi-generational Jewish man. And just to be looking at Israel's history here, and specifically in the life of David and Solomon, to know where, in the very short conversation that I had with him, his love and passion for his country. He even said a few things about what it's like to live in it. He was saying how safe Israel is, but how interesting it is to live in a place that is completely surrounded by its enemies. And he made it pretty clear quickly, when I asked if he was Jewish, he said, yes, but I'm not religious at all. So literally he had no care or concern for the purpose of God toward the Israelite people. He nearly cursed about it. Not in a derogatory way, but just in almost a flippancy, a nonchalant. It has no value. There's no value to it. And I thought, no judgment on the young man, but I see that, and then I see what Israel has gone through, and the heart and the shift of my heart is moved in the same way when I read about the lives of David and his sons, and the establishment of this kingdom, and the handing over the kingdom to Solomon, which is what we see in this first chapter of First Kings, and that you have a people who were given everything, and they became nothing. And hear me clearly, this is not a judgment on these people. This is a judgment against the heart of man toward the things of God and the wisdom of man versus the wisdom of God. Because what we're going to see here today, as we look through these scriptures, yet again, is that the ways of God were not the first consideration. And that's what, in God's sight and in history's sight, will always set apart David's reign and David's life as a man of God and a king and a son and a prophet and a priest from all others. So David's life is a type, it's a symbol of Christ, but a symbol of a son. And so is Solomon. What's difficult for us sometimes when we study is we look and we see the sinful things that these men did, which tells us two things. One, they're men, they're imperfect. And second of all, what God was doing here was not fully revealed or fulfilled in this time. So his ends were not in the ends of man, in the accomplishments of man, in this temple that was built, in that king sitting on the throne. Because what kingdom is there today in Israel? And what king sits on the throne? And in whose line is he? None. It's all gone. There's no temple. So people get excited about the building of the temple. Well, we need to ask ourselves, what temple was the Lord wanting? So what I really want is for the heart of God, the purpose of God, the intention of God, again, for us to notice that, but also for that to be well established in us. I feel very passionate about the house of God and the fulfillment of God's purposes. And what's amazing to me is how God highlights that in the lives of these people, even through his direct communication. Yet, they pursue their own ends. And the warning is no different to us in our own lives, because God's purpose hasn't changed from then until now. So let's begin to go through the first few chapters of 1 Kings. We'll highlight some of the storylines so that we're able to follow along. And as usual, I'll point out some specific things. So David is old in his life, aged, and he takes on, he begins to not fall ill so much, but he's an old man and needs assistance. So they bring in a young lady to help assist him there. But what happens is, as he gets old and he is about to pass away, one of his sons, Adonijah, decides that it's time to be king. He does this of his own will and volition. And he takes with him Abiathar, who is a descendant of Eli. Now, if you remember Eli, the priest, the Lord said some very specific things over his house, and basically that he would not be allowed to minister before the Lord, nor his descendants. And so, but here Abiathar takes, who is of the house of Eli, and Joab, who is currently the commander of David's army. And we know that Joab has, at least on 2 occasions, specifically killed innocent men, including, so that would be a 3rd occasion, I think, his own son Absalom. And so Joab, while seemingly a friend to the king, has directly disobeyed the will and the order of the king on several occasions. But Adonijah takes Abiathar and Joab. I find it interesting because he goes through this form of setting himself up as king. So there's a procession. He takes a priest, Abiathar, and he takes the leader of the army, and they blow the trumpet, and they offer sacrifices. They do all these things. There's if to use a familiar phrase, a form of godliness, but no authority, no power. Where was it supposed to come from? Well, it was supposed to come through the order of the king, from the father, through the priests that were appointed by God, none of which was taking place, which is why Zadok and Benaiah, who was a strong man of God and would eventually take Joab's place as commander of the armies, they weren't invited to this procession. So there's a concern that happens there, and Bathsheba is sent to David on Solomon's behalf by Nathan the prophet. And they go ask David, did you make Adonijah the king? And they explain what's going on. So there was a little bit of a plan and how to communicate with David what was actually happening. And so David says, nope, that's not the right order. So what Adonijah did was out of order, not by the will of the father, who was David the king, or the priest. So there was an order there that was meant to be in place. Now, obviously, there's some spiritual symbolism there in terms of the setting up of the authority of God and those who are put in that place and how they are to be in that place. The priest, Zadok, his name, we've referred to this before, but it means righteousness or righteous, justified, okay? Benaiah, which is this man that is set out to be the commander and also the upholder of the commands of the king, as Joab was, is now set up with Solomon. Benaiah's name means Jehovah has built, established. Some of the root meanings of this word, which I find interesting in the context of the purpose of God in building for or in raising up for himself a family, a people, That is the root meaning of Benaiah's name, is Jehovah has built his family. So the Ayah is the Jehovah part. The Bena is, there's a lot in this word, but the Hebrew word ben is the word for son. The Bena is built up, so it's the idea is to establish and build up your family, is what and so this is of Jehovah. So God establishes his own family is really a lot of what is in the name meaning of Benaiah. And then we have the priest serving at the time, righteous, the righteous one. And so God building up his righteous family. And they take Solomon and anoint him at Gihon, which, remember, the meaning is the Lord breaks forth or bursts forth. This was put in place through Nathan the prophet. So when Adonijah and Joab, when these guys hear of this, what's interesting is that they had taken people with them, and the guests, they didn't know what was going to happen. They were just invited to this celebration and feast, and then all of a sudden they make Adonijah king, and so everybody says, oh, okay, long live Adonijah. But then when the trumpet sounds and they hear the procession of the true king Solomon, what does everybody do? They go home. They disperse quickly. And so they then begin to plead for their own lives. And David, of course, makes Solomon king. He is anointed as king. And then 49 kind of describes, chapter 1, verse 49 describes what happened. And so at this, Adonijah's guests rose in alarm and dispersed, but Adonijah, in fear of Solomon, went and took hold of the horns of the altar. Solomon was told, Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon and is clinging to the horns of the altar. And he says, let King Solomon swear to me that he will not put his servant to death with the sword. And so Solomon says, if you show yourself to be a worthy man, then not a hair on your head will be harmed. And so they take him off, from clinging to the altar, and he says, go home. So then David is going to pass away, and but he gives these charges specifically to Solomon related to the relationships, some remaining relationships of the people that surround them. And he is careful to point out some details over that so that his kingdom can be firmly established. So we see that in the first portion of chapter 2. And I want to point out the first few verses in verses 3 through 5. And, David knows that he's about to pass away. But he says this, be strong and show yourself a man, verse 3, and observe what the Lord your God requires. He says, be careful to pay attention to the word of God, to the requirements of God. Walk in his ways and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and requirements, as written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me, which was, if your descendants watch how they live, if they walk faithfully before me in all their heart, with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. So yes, that was a reference to the physical reign there in that kingdom, but we also have the interweaving of the eternal promise here. And we'll see that is particularly the case because when Solomon's heart is divided because of all the women that he married and the gods that they worshipped, we see that God offers this same promise, even of a physical throne, to another man. So what God is looking on, again, is the heart. But more specifically, what he's looking for is those who will become a people of his ways. A different wisdom of life, a different perspective of life. This was what David had taught Solomon growing up in his house. This is what he encouraged Solomon to become. And so here he passes on that and then gives some other charges before he passes away. So then we see that Solomon's throne is established through, we had this Adonijah try to become king. Well, he takes a second shot trying for the throne again, asking for Abishag, the maidservant or the young lady that was taking care of David before his death, knowing that he would be able to take in the kingdom by taking this woman and his wife, but he kind of does it in a little bit of a sly way. Comes in to Solomon's mother Bathsheba, knowing that they have a close relationship, talks to her, tries to get her to convince Solomon to allow Adonijah to have Abishag as a wife. So remember, Solomon just said, don't mess around. Basically, he said, if you show yourself to be a worthy man, then nothing will no harm will come to you. But here he shows himself to be quite unworthy and still trying to usurp the throne. In fact, he basically says this very clearly in verse 15. He says to Bathsheba, "As you know, the kingdom was mine. All Israel looked to me as their king." But things changed, right? So he still has a considerable amount of discontent with the way that God is doing things. And he admitted it was from God, for it has come to him from the Lord. Yet he is still trying to usurp Solomon as king. So when he does this, then we jump over to verse 23. Solomon says, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if Adonijah does not pay with his life for this request." So he sent Benaiah to strike him down. And then Abiathar, here, this is the priest that was in the line of Eli. We'll look at verse 26 here. To Abiathar the priest, the king said, "Go back to your fields in Anathoth. You deserve to die, but I will not put you to death now, because you carried the ark of the sovereign Lord before my father and shared in all of my father's hardships." So Solomon removed Abiathar from the priesthood of the Lord, fulfilling the word of the Lord spoken at Shiloh about the house of Eli. And so then Joab also realizes that he's been caught again conspiring against the house of David. He goes to try and spare and save himself at the horns of the altar, refuses to let go, and then they don't want to kill him in the presence of the Lord that way, but he refuses to go. So Solomon says, "Strike him down there." And so they do. And so then in verse 35, we see that the king put Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, over the army in Joab's position and replaced Abiathar with Zadok, the priest. We also see in the latter part of this chapter, if you remember Shimei, remember when David was fleeing from Absalom, and Shimei came out and was casting curses on David and throwing dirt on the men, all that. But then after David was restored, he came and asked for forgiveness. Well, we had this command from David in David's charge. He said, don't hold Shimei guiltless. And so Solomon actually shows mercy on Shimei and says, if you'll stay in this city, then, I'll let you live. But you're not allowed to leave the city. So eventually Shimei leaves the city just for a short period of time, a few days, and comes back. Word comes down to Solomon, and Benaiah is sent out after him and strikes him down. The last verse of chapter 2 basically lays out the place of and the state of the kingdom here. And it says, the kingdom was now firmly established in Solomon's hands. So there were some remaining things that were taken care of, and now the Lord is going to fully establish his kingdom and his reign. So let's read the first few verses of chapter 3, because there's a couple important things to point out. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and married his daughter. That's a very interesting start to your reign, which the Lord specifically said, and he will say it again in the following chapters, Solomon did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord by taking on foreign wives. And this is one of the first things he does. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace in the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people, however, were still sacrificing in the high places because a temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David. So according to what his father David had taught and trained him in. Except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. So I always find it interesting how the Lord still works with someone. They go, they make these sacrifices, they go to Gibeon to do this. This is where the Lord speaks to Solomon the first time. So he still seeks to establish Solomon, to let him fulfill his destiny. And so Solomon prays to the Lord and asks for wisdom, and God blesses him, saying, well, you haven't asked me for riches and the death of your enemy and long life. You've asked me for wisdom to rule your people. And so that was what in verse 9 Solomon asked for specifically. Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? So God honors that, and he says, I'm going to give you the wisdom to do this. And because I really like what you asked for me here in the heart, then I'm also going to bless you with riches and honor and a peaceful life. And so then we see this first example of Solomon's wisdom expressed. Stepping back just before verse 9 and verse 8, I wanted to mention that we have a fairly direct reference where Solomon said, your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So this is a direct reference to the fulfillment of the covenant to Abraham, which is what? Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky and as uncountable as the sand on the seashore. And so you can bet that when David raised Solomon and taught him these statutes and the history of the Israelite nation and the promises of God, that those very things were taught to Solomon even as a young man, and now he is communicating with God about that. So God blesses him, and then he returns to Jerusalem. He has this wise ruling between the two mothers. And it says in verse 28, when all Israel heard the verdict that the king had given, they held the king in awe, because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. Now, something that we want to see throughout David and Solomon's reign is the spiritual symbolism of the eternal establishment of God's kingdom, his king, and his ways in the midst of his people. Because that is continually symbolized throughout this David and Solomon's reign. Over every other king that has ever ruled in Israel, these are the two kings that are exemplified and symbolic of the reign of Christ and his people and his kingdom. Although we see that that is not what was being fulfilled here. There was a potential for it, but the people were not raised up. So while we have a righteous king in David, even his son has a heart divided with the interest of the world and begins pursuing other things, and we don't see a righteous people raised up to become the people that God had desired. And however, we still do see many things in terms of the order of God and the establishment of his kingdom that are rightfully symbolized throughout in Solomon's reign. So I hope that's not confusing to you. But chapter 4 begins that way, and we can see that there was a very specific order set up in his kingdom. Verse 7, we can see that he laid out these several areas, the 12 districts, who all supplied the provisions for the king and the royal household. So I don't know when you read through that if you understood what they were doing, but each one of these would take a month of the year, basically, and they would be responsible for all the provision in the king's house. And each one had to provide the supplies for the king, his house, and his servants for 1 month of the year. And then it lists all those out. Then continues to describe what Saul's daily provisions were. Interestingly, in the prophets that follow the time of the kings, after Israel was dispersed and gone into captivity through Babylon and these other nations, because of their disobedience, we see some of these prophetic mentionings. I thought were kind of interesting. One of them shows here in verse 25 when it talks about Solomon's provisions and the peace that he reigned and the area that he reigned in. The verse 25 says this: during Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel from Dan to Beersheba lived in safety, each man under his own vine and fig tree. So when we see the prophets talk about restoration to the people of God, if you've read some of those, and we will obviously read these in the days to come, and we'll refer to this time period of history, there is a lot of reference to the reign of David and Solomon. So the prophets will say something like, he will have his own vine, his own fig tree to sit under, and he will partake of the fruit of his own vine, and no one will steal it away from him. That's all a reference to these kingdoms, this time period in Israel's history, which would become symbolic for all the fulfillment of God's promises. So again, there's a greater fulfillment to be had than the physical. And that is affirmed to us by the author of Hebrews, who said, these people weren't looking for a city and a promise that would be fulfilled here on earth. Rather, it was a heavenly one. And so I want us to see the establishment of some spiritual principle in terms of the order and the kingdom of God that is symbolized in the lives of these kings and their kingdoms, but not yet fulfilled until Christ and his kingdom. So there's some very specific things that we'll see in these next couple chapters about that. Verse 29 starts to say that God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. And Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the men of the East, greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than any other man, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. And his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He described plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. And he taught about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. Men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. Now again, there are many prophetic references here in the prophets, later prophets, referring to being taught from the house of God, the kingdom of God. What I want us to briefly look at is, because we have a description basically of Solomon's wisdom as one who was the son of David, so in the line of David, and blessed by God. But I want us to make a quick comparison, and by quick I mean in mentioning in the study today, but I'd really like for you to meditate on this principally. And let's jump over to the New Testament, to Matthew 11 and 12. So let's look at Matthew 12 first, just so that we can see this comparison. It's in the midst of a prophecy that Jesus is giving about the sign of Jonah. And he says this here. The queen of the south, which we'll read in future chapters, was the queen of Sheba, who came and saw the kingdom of Solomon and heard the wisdom of Solomon and saw the greatness of his rule. Jesus says here, the queen of the south will rise at judgment with this generation and condemn it. This is Matthew 12:42. For she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, which is what we've been describing here, right? And now, one greater than Solomon is here. So there's a greater wisdom. We just described Solomon's wisdom as the greatest on the earth and the greatest in the remembrance, even to the people that Jesus was speaking to at this point. Now, what he had just previously said earlier, let's turn back a chapter to chapter 11, where Jesus is specifically talking about John the Baptist. So 11:11, Matthew 11:11 says this, I tell you the truth, speaking of John the Baptist, among those born of women, okay, including Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, Solomon, Isaiah, Noah, Moses, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet, he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. So, a direct reference here to the true nature of God's kingdom. Earthly or not? No, definitely not. So what we see here in Solomon's life, in Solomon's wisdom, in Solomon's temple, in Solomon's reign, in his kingdom, in his rule, in his wealth, is symbolic of a spiritual reality. It is a shadow of something greater. It was great, especially in the eyes and the understanding of man, but it was a shadow still. Much of it was shadowed by the unwillingness and by the selfishness and flesh of man and the desires of man and the wisdom of the world. Clearly, much of Solomon's wisdom had to do with worldly things. Yet he was not wise enough to be obedient to the word of God, even through the encouragement of his own father. So Solomon's kingdom is a type, but not a reality yet fulfilled in terms of the purpose of God until Jesus came as the one greater than Solomon and set to fulfill the heart of God and the purposes of God in his kingdom through the called out ones, the church. God wasn't looking for a single righteous man, not even like David, not even Jesus himself. It's not all that God was looking for in the midst of mankind. He wants a people, a family, okay? A governing kingdom. Now that was specifically indicated by those who were put around Solomon, whose name means peace, the king of peace, with Benaiah and Zadok. Remembering the name meanings. Zadok means righteous, justified. Benaiah, the building up and establishment of the house, the family of God. I've told you before, pay attention to name meanings. One thing I wanted to mention today, for those who have access to the internet or even on a smartphone, there's an app called Blue Letter Bible, and it's got a very easy way to not only read the scriptures, but you can tap on any given verse, and then it brings up some study options. The only one that I use is the very top one, which is an interlinear concordance. And what that does is when you go to a verse, and then you go to the interlinear, it actually takes every word in the English and it shows you the transliterated version of that word in the Hebrew, or in the case of the New Testament, the Greek. And you can actually go to those words and touch on them. So if I wanted to look at the meeting of Edom or Joab here in 1 Kings 11:15 is what I've got it right here. So I can go, for it came about, and then the second phrase, when David, and I can touch on David's name, and it brings up the Hebrew word for his name. And it says the outline of biblical David means beloved. It also says who he was, the youngest son of Jesse. And then if you continue to scroll down, it'll show you all the times that he's mentioned in the scriptures. Isn't that cool? So then if I want to go to the root meaning of David's name, Dode, it means beloved, love, uncle, loved one, uncle, love. So you have all these name meanings. You can do that with any word in the language. You can look at the backside of the language, because you'll see that many times things are translated very differently. So that's a nice study app to use that can help bring in a lot of understanding, and that in the case, because many of the names and places and events and things like that have very significant meaning, not just as a word, but in terms of the purpose of God revealed through the names of these people and places. So what we have established now is that God is after a spiritual house, spiritual kingdom, and a spiritual people. And these lives and the life of Solomon and his reign is, yes, it's a prophetic picture, but a symbolic picture, a spiritual picture of a greater reality. So let's move on to chapter 5. And we have the preparations for the building of the temple. Some interesting things in chapter 5 that I thought were really worth looking into. I hope that you can spend a little bit more time with it, but let's touch on those now. It says, when Hiram, verse 1, king of Tyre, heard that Solomon had been anointed king to succeed his father David, he sent his envoys to Solomon because he had always been on friendly terms with David. And Solomon sent back this message to Hiram. So Tyre is mentioned many times in the prophets as where the goods and services come from. We see that he supplied, much of the lumber and materials that were needed for the building of the temple. And so this is a chapter that we would want to refer to in a person and circumstances that we would want to refer to when we're looking and bringing a little bit more depth and context into what the prophets say, because again, it's spiritually symbolic. Verse 3 says this, and this was Solomon's response to Hiram. You know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, he could not build a temple for the name of the Lord his God. Now, interesting, listen to this. Until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. Now, isn't that incredible? Now, most of you listening may not know this, but just yesterday, Sunday morning, we specifically looked at Psalm 110. Why don't you go ahead and turn to Psalm 110 and notice this. Solomon knew, he was told by David, the purposes of God. Now, his understanding spiritually of the purposes of God may not have been fully there. But here's a messianic psalm of David right here. The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Now, refer again back to 5:3, what Solomon says here. You know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, very interesting that I had this young man talk about having enemies on all sides yesterday. Literally, the Lord brings all this stuff together in this way all the time to confirm his purposes and his word. He could not build a temple for the name of the Lord his God until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. So was there a physical fulfillment here in Solomon's time and reign? Yes. But David was looking forward to the reign of Christ and the establishment of an eternal kingdom. And it's directly referenced here by Solomon as he confers with Hiram. It's amazing to me. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is no adversary or disaster. Again, the prophets directly refer to these words. When we look in the latter chapters of Isaiah and other prophets, okay? So we have a prophetic picture of God's favor toward the builders of his house. I find this very interesting as well. He communicates with him about getting these materials, and then in verse 10, it says this in chapter 5, 1 Kings. In this way, Hiram kept Solomon supplied with all the cedar and pine logs he wanted, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, in addition to 20,000 baths of pressed olive oil. Now, interesting, what do you make with wheat and olive oil? Bread. Okay? So we have the bread coming out of the house, the temple, the provisions from Solomon's kingdom. Okay? He continued to do this for Hiram year after year. The Lord gave Solomon wisdom just as he had promised him. There were peaceful relations between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. So I find it very interesting, especially if we, Solomon is basically giving bread to Hiram. His name means noble, okay, like a white cloth. So we have some of this prophetic imagery here, spiritual imagery here, of being fed from the kingdom, the house, the rule, the provisions of Solomon. And so this in many ways is referred to in prophetic scriptures like Isaiah 60, okay? And he talks about how the provisions will come to the people of God and to the temple of the Lord. Okay? There's also a reference here early on. Arise and shine, verse 1 of Isaiah 60 says, for your light has come, the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, thick darkness is over the peoples, but the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, kings to the brightness of your dawn. Kings will serve you, foreigners will rebuild your walls. Okay, that's verse 10 here. Your gates will always stand open. Listen, verse 13, the glory of Lebanon will come to you. What did Hiram supply? Look at verse 13 here in Isaiah 60. The glory of Lebanon will come to you. The pine, the fir, the cypress together will adorn the place of my sanctuary, and I will glorify the place of my feet. Very interesting. That's exactly what's described here as Solomon builds the temple. Okay? And so we have this. I just find it interesting how the prophets also look back at the splendor and glory of Solomon's kingdom, but it's been destroyed at that point. And so they too are seeing a greater fulfillment, a greater reality than what was even fulfilled with Solomon, as Jesus refers to as well. As Peter preached at the day of Pentecost, when he preached and said, hey, we're talking about a whole different kind of life. We're talking about a whole different kind of kingdom. You can go to David's grave and see where he was buried. But we're talking about a king who has an indestructible life. That was Jesus. So what was the gospel that they were really preaching in the context of the history of Israel and God's purpose? Something greater. Jesus himself said to the rulers, I think it was to Pilate, if my kingdom was of this world, then my subjects wouldn't be allowing this to happen. But my kingdom is not of this world. So Solomon begins the work of building the temple. I found it very interesting. Chapter 6, verse 1. We're going to go a little bit long today. I want to get through a certain portion here. Are you okay on time, Elaine? Okay. So 6:1 says that in the 480th year, but the Septuagint says 440th year. And if you remember, how long was were the Israelites in slavery in Egypt? About 430 years. So that was previous to them becoming a people set apart by God, taken out of Egypt. So I want to point out, as we do each time, the reference to being taken out of slavery from Egypt. And it's always important to see that, because it's so closely tied to the eternal purposes of God for mankind. And when we see this reference, we need to pay attention to it, not just for the sake of paying attention to it and making another mark, but as a declaration of God's purpose. And the timing is very interesting as well. So nearly the same amount of time that they were in slavery until this kingdom is established and the temple is built. In the 480th year after the Israelites had come out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to lay the foundations of the temple. Okay, the month of Ziv is the 2nd month. In our modern day calendar, this is during the spring, so April or May. All right. The word Ziv actually means brightness. Okay, and this is when the foundations of the Lord's temple are laid. And it begins to describe the measurements of the temple. Verse 7, I want to point out. Verse 6 and 7. He talks about some of the details of the temple, but in verse 7 it says this. In building the temple, only blocks dressed at the quarry were used. Okay? No hammer, chisel, or any other tool was heard at the temple site when it was being built. So that's a very interesting image. It's more than an image, because I can both see and hear, or not hear, what's going on at this construction. Okay? There's something about this particular verse that is pointing to the unseen nature, the unheard of nature of God's work. It resembles to me what no eye has seen and no ear has heard in the way that God does what he does in the building up of his house. So I won't go much further than that, because it seems a little enigmatic, but I just wanted to point that out. It was a very interesting point that was made there. So there's a continuation of the description of the building of the temple, and then the Lord came to Solomon again. Okay, verse 11, the word of the Lord came to Solomon, as for this temple you are building, and here's the big word, if you follow my decrees, carry out my regulations, and keep all my commands and obey them, I will fulfill through you the promise I gave to David your father. And I will live among the Israelites, God with you, God among you, Emmanuel, and will not abandon my people Israel. So Solomon built the temple and completed it. So we have this description of all the cedar that lined everything, and then the inner sanctuary where the ark was even lined with gold. And we have a mentioning of all, basically everything was covered with gold except for the inner court, with the cedar wood, except for the inner court where the ark was covered with gold. And then he finishes the temple 7 years later. Okay, so this is verse 37 of chapter 6. The foundation of the temple was laid in the 4th year of the month of Ziv. In the 11th year, 7 years later, So he started 4 years into his reign. He finished 7 years later in the 11th year. In the month of Bul, okay, Bul means increase or produce. It's in the month of October and November. So it could have either been in either of these months that we have the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, but that's when this was finished, okay? In all its details, according to its specifications, he had spent 7 years building it. And then Solomon builds his house. And honestly, this is when something is stirred inside me almost to the point of disheartenment when I read of this man's incredible palace, because he built something that was even more opulent and greater in size and everything than the temple of the Lord. Interestingly, it's anyway, I won't go into all the description of that. I just find that was very interesting. Well, let's move on to chapter 7, though. Solomon's palace is huge, but then he goes on to finish out the temple furnishings. In verse 21, it speaks specifically of the pillars in the front of the temple. And yeah, they were actually named. These pillars were named. One is Jachin, the other is Boaz. The one on the right is Jachin, the one on the left is Boaz. The name meanings there, again, are important. Jachin means he will establish. So we have the establishment, again, of the house of God. Boaz's name means fleetness, but specifically there's a reference here to the Lord himself being the kinsman redeemer. And that is a pillar principle and truth within the context of God's house. So there's a lot of description here of the inner design and intricacy of the temple here. If you want to spend time studying those things, there is a lot of symbolism that is spiritually symbolic in relation to the imagery, the shapes, the fruits, all the things that were used in the temple, and including the tools that were used in the priestly service and the furniture. And so all of that is completed, and then all the treasuries of David that he had dedicated to the Lord were then brought into the temple. So verse 51 in chapter 7, in chapter 7 says, when all the work King Solomon had done for the temple of the Lord was finished, he brought in the things his father David had dedicated, the silver and the gold and the furnishings, and he placed them in the treasuries of the Lord's temple. And then in chapter 8, we have the Lord, the ark of the Lord is brought into the temple. It says they brought the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David, and all the men of Israel came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month. So again, we see this happening during the Feast of Tabernacles. So if you remember how the Jewish calendar works, the feasts are based on not a specific date in the year, but by the counting of the Omer and by the counting and looking out for the moons. And so the actual calendar dates of the feast during a year could change. And so we see that both the completion of the temple and the dedication of the temple happened during the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, which was the final celebration of all the harvest of the year. And so in this case, it happens in the 7th month, Ethanim, which means enduring or ever flowing. So this was happening during the Feast of the Tabernacles. Verse 9 of chapter 8 I thought was important and interesting. It says, there was nothing in the ark except the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb, where the Lord had made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. Interestingly, Brother Emmanuel had asked Elaine specifically yesterday what was in the ark and what it did represent. It wasn't just the tablets, was it? No. In fact, the New Testament authors were careful to reference the 3 things that were in the ark, but that during the time of Moses, not just the tablets, okay, but also Aaron's rod or staff, and then also the manna, because each had a spiritual representation. So it seems very interesting to me that there's a specific account given as to what is in the ark, and that is the only thing that was in the ark. Nothing else was in there. So we can clearly see there's something missing here. Even though we have this high point of celebration because of the dedication of the temple. Even to the extent of verse 10, it says, verse 9, I go back to verse 9 again, that Moses had placed in it at Horeb where the Lord made a covenant with Israel. Again, we have this reference, after they came out of Egypt. Anytime we see that, we need to know that we need to understand something from a spiritual perspective, point of view, in terms of the work of God and how the work of God plays out within the context of the life of man to take him from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light and everything that ensues as a part of that work. So one is getting it out from becoming a slave, going from being a slave to a son, then giving the idea and the mentality and the mindsets of a slave out of you. So that's all these things that happen with Egypt. One thing that we're going to see happen a lot over the next few chapters is there's this incredible pattern that anytime there's a persecution of an individual, you will find that they flee to Egypt, that they're taken to Egypt for a period of time. So we see the people of Egypt. We see many rulers flee to Egypt. We saw Jesus flee to Egypt. Moses fled to Egypt before Israel went to. All these things happen. Okay, and when we see that kind of repetition throughout the scriptures, we need to know that there's a spiritual principle behind it, and the spiritual principle is not just like a commandment or a law, as much as it is the way that God works in and through certain things. So verse 10 continues and says, when the priest withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. I find what Solomon says here in verse 12 very interesting. He says, the Lord said. So again, Solomon was raised in David's house, taught by David. There were many things about the ways of the Lord that David tried to convey to his son Solomon and that he held with him. So listen to what Solomon says, specifically in relation to what we just read in chapter 60 of Isaiah as well. The Lord said he would dwell in a dark cloud. I find that very interesting. Of Isaiah 60, see, darkness covers the earth, and a thick darkness is over the people, but the Lord rises upon you. So the dark cloud, we find it to be this ominous, judgmental thing, but we also find it to be this is actually the way that the Lord approached Israel in the desert and came over Mount Horeb. Remember, we talked about the visualization of that, where the Lord was seen coming to them, marching across the desert in this cloud in his presence. And so, Solomon directly references this, and then he sings a song of praise and dedication to the Lord. I'm not going to detail that. I had planned to read through that. I would encourage you to read the remainder of chapter 8 again, because there's a lot of specific things that are mentioned by Solomon in relation to his kingship and his kingdom being a type and or shadow of a greater kingdom to come. And he specifically references those here in his prayer to the Lord. Also in his prayer of dedication, he, in verse 23, says, O Lord, God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on the earth below, you who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way. And to those who do so, you fulfill your promise. So he said, you promised that we would build a throne, and that that the throne of David would be established, and that he would be one to build the house. Verse 27 directly references Solomon's, his own quandary about the dwelling place of God. Look at this in verse 27. But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built. Yet give attention to your servant's prayer and plea for your mercy. So he asked for a blessing, in all these different circumstances, but he recognizes right here, how can the God of heaven dwell in a building built by the hands of men? And there is a truth there. He isn't. He will build his own house. And Solomon, while he built a temple for God, was not the promised son who would come as the Son of God and build the dwelling place of God on earth in the lives of his people, and not in a building made of the earthly stone. So Peter references to this, talking about the house of God as a spiritual house, and that the building of it is a spiritual building, which is why the lives of those who are built in it are considered to be living stones. So there's a lot of reference here in terms of the building of the temple and the work that was done to put it into place, and the work that God does in the lives of his people to build up his house. Again, this all happened during the Feast of Tabernacles. There's many verses throughout this chapter that I would refer to. 27 was one in relation to him knowing that God cannot dwell in a temple made by man's hands. He speaks in verse 30 as the heaven is the dwelling place of God. And so there's throughout several of these scriptures and following, and there's this difference between hear us from heaven. He's not saying hear us from the temple here. He's saying hear us from heaven. There's a recognition that this is not the true eternal dwelling place of God. He also refers in verse 36. He says, when the heavens are shut up and there is no rain because your people have sinned against you, and when they pray toward this place and confess your name and turn from their sin because you have afflicted them, verse 36, then hear from heaven and forgive them of the sin your servants, and forgive the sin of your servants. Teach them the right way to live, and send rain on the land you gave your people for an inheritance. This is a reference to another culture, another way of life, another wisdom of life that is being asked for, but that the people never entered into and fulfilled, and that God has and is calling us to enter into and fulfill. And then in this prayer, he gives a blessing to the assembly, finishing in verse 61 here. It says, but your hearts must be fully committed to the Lord your God, to live by his decrees and obey his commands as at this time. So that's how and when and in what way the Lord will fulfill his promises and the requests that Solomon has in prayer. And so the temple is dedicated, and then the Lord appears to Solomon again for a second time. So this is a personal communication between the Lord and Solomon. And he says this in verse 4. I see that you've done all this. It's pleasing to me. But here's what I'm looking for. As for you, verse 4, if you walk before me in integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command, and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your throne, your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. But, verse 6, if you or your sons turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them and will reject this temple. I will reject this temple. Isn't that interesting? I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. And though this temple is now imposing, this great, beautiful thing, all who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, Why has the Lord done such a thing to this land, to this temple? And the people will answer, because they'll know why. Because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord has brought all this disaster on them. One other thing that I want to point out in Solomon's other activities as it continues to chapter 9, and we'll finish quickly now. So after 20 years, verse 10, in which Solomon built these two buildings, the temple of the Lord and his royal palace, he gave 20 towns in Galilee to Hiram, the king of Tyre, because Hiram had supplied him with all the cedar of pine and gold he wanted. Verse 12, but when Hiram went from Tyre to see the towns that Solomon had given him, he was not pleased with them. Verse 13, what kind of towns are these you have given me, my brother? He asked. And he called them the land of Kabul. Now, the word means good for nothing. And they are called that to this day. Now, I find that very interesting because where did Jesus come from? Well, Galilee. Nazareth was in Galilee. Now, if you remember in the New Testament, when the disciples were being called by Jesus, this is actually in John chapter 1. I want you to see how these things, where the roots of these things come from. I think it's kind of funny. Look in John chapter 1, I think around verse 28, says, get to it. It's also in chapter 7. So it says, the next day Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, follow me. And Philip, and like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. And Philip found Nathanael and told him, we have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And what does Nathanael say? Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? That's a direct reference to Hiram's statement, the good-for-nothing land of Galilee. And then the same thing in chapter 7, same book in the Gospel of John, it says this in, oh goodness, it's, I think in the middle of the chapter. Oh, yeah, verse 27. But we know where this man and Jesus is from. We know where he's from. When the Christ comes, no one will know where he's from. And so, that was not where it referenced it. Jesus still teaching, he cries out. Yeah, where is it? Anyway, it basically says it again. It says, basically, we know that he came from Galilee. Can anything good come from Galilee? Oh, here it is. Verse 41, others said, he is the Christ. Still others said, how can Christ come from Galilee? You see that? Nothing good comes from Galilee. It was all referenced back again here to Solomon's and David's kingdom. Does the scriptures not say that the Christ will come from David's family and from Bethlehem, the town where David lived? Thus the people were divided because of Jesus. I just found that very interesting. I'd never seen that before. That Hiram here says the land, these cities were good for nothing. And there's actually a prophecy as well, directly related both to Galilee and others. So anyway, some interesting stuff that comes out of the early history of the kingdoms here. So kings from all over the world, at the area at the time, visit Solomon. They come to hear of his wisdom. We know that the Queen of Sheba, who we just referenced in the New Testament, comes to see him. She's amazed at Solomon's splendor. Another reference that's actually in Matthew again, and we're nearly done. We're just going to touch on this last part of chapter 10 and then briefly go over chapter 11. We'll be finished for the day. But Matthew 6 I find very interesting in this light because we're talking all about the wisdom and the splendor of Solomon. And we just saw that Jesus said one greater than Solomon is here. Previous to that, he mentioned John the Baptist being the least in the kingdom, although he was the greatest among all men. And then I want to refer to Matthew chapter 6 as well. And Jesus speaking here, which is more commonly known as the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, all those things. In verse 28 of chapter 6, he says this. And he specifically, in 25, he starts talking about don't worry about the things of this world, the things of this life, the provisions of this life, the food you eat, the clothes you wear, the house you live in. God takes care of all those things. And he says this in verse 28. And why do you worry about these things? See how the lilies of the field grow? They don't labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that's how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and gone tomorrow, and thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, O little of faith? So what does he go on to say here? Verse 33. But seek first his kingdom. He had just made a direct reference to the king of the greatest kingdom that had ever existed in Israel's history. But seek first his kingdom. What kingdom? The kingdom of God and his righteousness. Now, was Solomon's kingdom not just established through Zadok and Benaiah as a building up of God's family and kingdom of righteousness? But seek his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given you as well. Sadly, and I wanted to make sure we ended at this point so that we understand the measurements of the fulfillment of God's purposes not yet completed because of what we see happen in Solomon's life as well. Solomon takes on many wives. Verse 2. Well, start in verse 1. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites. They were from the nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them. Why? Because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Solomon, the divided heart, turning into a divided kingdom. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth, 300 concubines, that's over 1,000 wives. And as he grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not fully devoted. It was divided to the Lord God as the heart of David his father had been. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. So the Lord, verse 9, became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. Verse 11, key verse here. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, what have we learned about this? Your mindset, your way of thinking. A wrong wisdom. Wow, what an interesting statement coming from the one proclaimed to be the wisest in the world. Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. So he raises up Hadad, a mighty one who was actually a descendant of Ishmael, who was from Edom, which means red. So there's a reference here to the descendants of Esau. Jacob I have loved, Israel I have hated. He raises these up. Isaac and Ishmael, see the dichotomy here, are raised up against Solomon. And we have a divided kingdom. Interestingly, and we will end with this today, verse 36, chapter 11, he speaks to Jeroboam. Jeroboam. And he says this, starting in he's speaking to him. Well, let's start in 34. But I will not take the whole kingdom out of Solomon's hand. I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of David my servant, whom I chose and who David observed my commandments and statutes. I will take the kingdom from his son's hands, Rehoboam, and give you 10 tribes. I will give 1 tribe to his son, so that David my servant may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. However, listen to this, verse 37. As for you, Jeroboam, I will take you, and you will rule over all that your heart desires, and you will be king over Israel. If you do whatever I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes, by keeping my statutes and commands as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty enduring as the one that I built for David, and will give Israel to you. I will humble David's descendants because of this, but not forever. So, the prophetic word from the Lord through Jeroboam. And then we come to the last verses of this chapter, and we see that Solomon, he dies with the kingdom yet in peace, and then immediately the kingdom is torn away from his son Rehoboam. So we'll continue there next week. I apologize for going long today, very long. But there was a lot of ground to cover here in these chapters. So thank you guys for your time and attention.